Hello and welcome to the Oak Spring podcast, where we celebrate the legacy of Mrs. Bunny Mellon through the work of the Oak Spring Garden Foundation. I'm Chris Stafford, and this is Season 3, Episode 7. On this month's episode, we are reviewing a conference which Oak Spring hosted in May this year that brought together an equal number of both art historians and ecologists. The primary aim of the event was to develop cross-disciplinary conversations and explore the ways that art, especially landscape paintings, can be a tool to learn more about ecology and the environment at the time they were painted. As this conference is new, we're still in the ideation phase, so projects and publications may be forthcoming in the future. The focus of this episode is to present the concept and findings of the conference and convey why this type of collaboration is useful and important. And to help us understand this are two of the founders of the conference, Marlyse Duguid, who's the senior lecturer and research scientist at Yale University, and Dana Warren, associate professor in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society at Oregon State University. And they join me now. Welcome and thank you for joining me on the Oak Spring podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Well, I want to start, maybe I come to you, Marlyse, first, to get a little bit of background. Of course, you got to know Peter here at Oak Spring. Talk a little bit about that relationship and why Oak Spring was on your mind when it came to this project.
Yeah, so I have known Peter since 2008 when I was a graduate student at Yale School of the Environment. We overlapped when he was there as the dean, and I got to know him a little bit at a conference actually at Q where he also worked on plant conservation. And so while I didn't work directly, he wasn't on my committee, we got to know each other and kind of our love of plants and botany through those years when I was a master's student, a PhD student. So when he moved down to Oak Spring, we got to collaborate a little bit and I got to come visit. And then when I joined the faculty, we collaborated on a couple of projects and I just fell in love with the place the first time I visited. And so that was how it got on my radar.
Dana, the conference itself, I understand, is your baby. Tell us how that came about and how you were introduced to Oak Spring.
I was introduced by Marlyse, and it came about because we had a previous project that was funded by the National Science Foundation through their EAGER grant program to try to put together a collaboration between art historians and ecologists. And that project wrapped up and we wrote our paper and we were really trying to think about sort of what's next. And when we published our paper, Marlyse reached out and said, hey, I've done a similar thing. And, are you doing anything else with this? And essentially it was, well, no, but we're really looking for the next thing. And then I said, I think it would be really fun to try to do some kind of conference or workshop. And she said, I have the perfect place because she had done work at Oak Spring. And so she was really the nexus that brought it from an idea of, hey, we should do something into let's actually turn it into a real product.
Give us the short bio, if you would, Dana, of your background on this subject.
It's sort of a long-ish story, so I'll try to be short on it. But within this subject, I'm an aquatic ecologist by training. And during graduate school, I was really interested in understanding wood in streams in the northeastern U.S. And wood is a really important structural element in streams. But we have very little old-growth forest in the Northeast. So the question was, how much wood sort of is there, or how much wood should there be in these streams? And I looked at these paintings from the Hudson River School in the mid-1800s, which had a lot of wood in the streams, and I got really excited about trying to use those paintings to understand this sort of historical condition. And I talked to a senior faculty member, and they said, you can't trust any of those. Too much artistic license. And I sort of sat and had it in my pocket and sort of I gave up on it, but kind of had it in the back of my mind. And it was at a kid's birthday party at OSU at Oregon State University, and was just, talking among different parents. And one of them said, I'm an art historian. And I said, I always had this idea about using 19th century landscape art or Hudson River art to look at historic environments, environmental conditions, but of course you can't trust that because of artistic license. And he said, well, that's not true. He said, if you do your art history homework, you can absolutely trust certain stuff. And that's really what launched my interest in this work. And this person, Peter Betjeman, and I wrote a grant together to NSF. That was what sort of spurred writing this grant. We brought in Eleanor Harvey from the Smithsonian American Art Museum, as well as a number of other ecologists, and we're able to write this really sort of fun, cool, inclusive grant and bring on a graduate student. So that was sort of my origin. I'd been thinking about it for a while. I had rejected it, and then was fortunately corrected by an art historian to say, you can do it. You just gotta work with the right people.
So how did you perceive that artwork itself, this art, could serve historical ecology?
Well, I definitely had thought about this idea of landscape change, again, early on, thinking about this wood and streams piece, but really I grew up in New England, and I had read Changes in the Land, this very influential book that got me thinking more about how can we understand how these landscapes have changed over time. And I was familiar with the Hudson River School of Art, and it's more sort of thinking in terms of the Adirondacks of upstate New York. But it just got me thinking in general about trying to look at these paintings and understand what they might have captured.
Marlyse, if I can come to you, I get, if you would, some examples of artworks or artists that are useful for this type of conversation that you had.
Oh, yeah. So it's actually really interesting because I'm very new to this, and I kind of came with a lot less art history background, I think, than Dana did. I hadn't even thought of myself as a historical ecologist, but I'm a pretty broadly trained field naturalist, and I teach courses all about how do we read the forested landscape, how do we understand kind of the history of a site, and what does that mean for conservation and restoration. And so indirectly, I was teaching historical ecology, but didn't really have that name on it. And I got brought in, I'm also doing kind of a long version of this. I got brought in based on that expertise on reading the landscape locally and kind of regionally by Mark Mitchell, who's the curator at the Yale University Art Gallery, and a colleague at Yale who were working on doing a show called Natural Histories. And so, while Dana was working on kind of doing a paper, understanding how art could inform kind of field ecology or ecological studies, I was doing the other side where I was helping an art historian understand the ecology of what he was looking at. And so I hadn't worked with any of this art really before that show came out. And the majority of to echo what Dana said, the majority of those pieces were from the Hudson River School and in the Northeast. So it was really useful for me to be able to look at it and say, oh, this is the species that this probably is, or, oh, can you see how, this colonial development may have influenced the way this river is flashy, or these trees look young because of this and that, or those sorts of things. And so often, for the stuff we've been working on specifically, we've been kind of in that range of mostly that sort of school and the Northeast region. But when we brought these folks together for the workshop, and I think Dana could probably expand more, people had a much broader sort of things that they were interested in and using, and all sorts of landscapes from all over the United States and globally, and definitely broader than kind of this more sort of 18th century art or 19th century art that we had been talking about.
Dana, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Marlyse hits it on the head in terms of we really started with this Hudson River School in part because I think it's more well known as having this ethos of painting sort of more true to nature. But what's been really fun is to think about these other systems. Like here in Oregon, for example, I've been really interested in looking at landscapes that still have the fingerprints of indigenous stewardship, in particular burning, intentional burning on those landscapes. And we can see in some of those early pictures that aren't necessarily from the Hudson River School, more sort of pictures by people who were out exploring those landscapes, how that indigenous stewardship sort of manifested visually on the landscape. So I think that's just one example of us recognizing this as a tool and then beginning to really dig into this more broadly. And there's just Marlyse and I and a couple of colleagues were also recently working on a review paper, really trying to dig into this use of art. And there's some really just super exciting examples of, people using the predators and or the mammals depicted in Egyptian hieroglyphics over thousands of years to look at changes in communities in the Nile River basin, and looking at things like the washed out colors of Turner paintings as a way to infer degrees of air pollution in London in the turn of the century. So anyway, there's just amazing stuff I think that's out there that people have used that we're learning more and more about. And that really highlight the potential for this kind of engagement between art historians and ecologists.
Yes, I mean, that example is a good one, isn't it, for us to visualize the Turner paintings and atmospheres that he creates. So tell us then, when an ecologist looks at a historical landscape painting, what they might see as compared to what an art historian might see.
Well, so when we did this collaboration, this NSF-funded collaboration, it was during COVID, and so we weren't able to get together, but what we did is we had a number of us all sitting and looking at images over Zoom together, which was just amazing. And so I have one particular example of this where we were looking at the classic Thomas Cole painting of the oxbow. And in that painting, on the sort of left-hand side, you can see a forest landscape. He has a complex forest, and we were looking at it, and it was myself and the other ecologists, and then Eleanor and Peter. I should name the other ecologists. It was Bill Keaton and Dave Shaw and Isabel Monk, and then our graduate student Harper Loeb. So we were looking at this, and the ecologists were looking at this painting, and I encourage anybody to pull this up. And we were trying to figure out the age or stage of the forest. Essentially, the question was Cole painting an old-growth forest? That's what the ecologists were really interested in. So we're looking at standing dead trees in that painting and then trying to classify the degree of decay on those trees. And so we spent a bunch of time digging into this. And there were these two sort of classic blasted trees in the front, and we were looking at those. And then at one point, Eleanor, the woman from the Smithsonian, said, "Well, hold on a second." She said, "I've never looked at this painting like this ever before." She said, "But when I see this painting, I look at those two trees, which we had just spent 10 minutes trying to unpack. And she said, I see one tree cradling another tree, which represents the loss of wilderness in this system. And I had never looked at it like that. It just blew me away. And so, but she had clearly been seeing that allegory and seeing that imagery in the painting. And I was looking at it just for this sort of strictly ecological perspective. So sorry, it's a long answer, but that's one example of how we were looking at this painting and sort of brought this really new perspective to each other in the way that we were each looking at the image.
So Marlyse, I'm wondering then what questions and topics could be most useful for ecologists to ask art historians when they're doing their research, and vice versa.
Yeah, so there's a ton of different questions you can do. There's a lot of folks interested in kind of climate change and changes in glaciers or changes in sea level or kind of these physical landscape features that folks are interested in. The other thing that I learned so much doing this work is about these plein air sketches versus final product. And so being able to talk with art historians about whether or not you can get at source material to kind of understand, when they were actually there observing versus kind of when they were finishing up these products in their studios. And so really understanding the art historians seem to know how much plein air was happening, how the environmental ethos of individual artists were they, fancying themselves to be naturalists, or were they not? Who were their patrons? I had never thought about understanding who the patrons were. And that I learned a lot from looking at art with the historians, where they were saying like, oh, well, at this point in that artist's career, their patron was this person. And that kind of meant these sorts of things were happening in the art. And so getting that background context for the time in which the artist was working, who they were working for, who were they communicating with, what kind of natural history training did they have, how much were they in the field. Some of these paintings were from areas these folks had never been in, and others are from places where they were intimately familiar, and maybe they were there every day for, months on end. And so that is all sorts of information where before I would have just looked at a painting and assumed that it was based on something that they had seen, and that's not always the case. One great example that I thought was really interesting from this workshop we did is we went and saw an exhibit on Niagara Falls, which was kind of a side thing at the end of the workshop. And one of the art historians was like, well, actually, when this was painted, the artist got rid of all the development along the banks because he was trying to advocate for kind of eminent domain and conservation and preservation of this landscape, and it was already heavily developed. And so this painting actually erased development and kind of put a more of a wilderness myth in, which I had never considered before.
You mentioned climate change just then, Marlyse. I'm wondering, with this type of collaboration, does it provide a means to address contemporary issues such as climate change?
Yeah, I think it does in a number of ways. I mean, there is a lot of sort of not historical art, ecology collaborations going on, but modern art and ecology and conservation collaborations going on. And we had a number of folks who are kind of working in that realm as well. Like, how do we use art to communicate with folks about these sort of like big issues affecting the world? But also understanding how climatic change has affected landscapes through time. One example, which came up in our show at the the Yale University Art Gallery, was that, here's another example where the curator was looking at this picture from the Adirondacks, and it was, oh, well, this fire damage is all about, kind of this desolation of the Civil War. And then my colleague and I were like, or it could just be that there was a fire. And it turns out my colleague was able to go in and get climate data for that specific region and found out it was kind of at the end of a long drought. So in fact, it probably was climate. And so we think of climate change as being something and it is incredibly severe right now, but we've always had these big kind of climactic changes that have affected landscapes. And so being able to see those moments in the past as well, and then be able to go back on historical records around and using with tree rings and dendrochronology, or whether we're using atmospheric carbon, or all of these sorts of environmental measures that ecologists and environmental scientists use, along with then trying to figure out how much of, these sorts of climactic, I'll call them disturbances, are showing up in the art, are sort of artistic expression versus actually giving us a historic record for when we didn't really have photographs to know that record was happening.
Dana, could you speak to the importance of this kind of collaboration and this cross-disciplinary collaboration, and how it's useful today, and what were your biggest takeaways in the value of this conference?
I think for me, it's in learning the importance of context. And I think Marlyse just provided a number of really great examples of understanding the context in which the artists were working is that art history homework that allows us to figure out the degree to which we can use these paintings to understand the past. So to me, it's being able to work with people who have really thought deeply and understand the kind of environment in which this work was being done is really, I think, important before we sort of start to to take those images as sort of truth, and I'm putting truth in air quotes that you can't see. But I think it's really understanding that piece. I think actually for me, and Marlyse brought this up, but I'll reiterate it, the difference between plein air sketches and compositions. And what is it that the artists are doing? They have different motivations for each of those. And generally the compositions are the really big ones that you can find online. So our access to the information in the compositions or we have better access to the information in the compositions, but oftentimes those compositions are compromised in some way relative to sort of a strict truth. But there are pieces in there that really are truthful. And so the example that we had unpacked in one of our papers was a famous painting in the Met called In the Woods by Asher Durand. And in that painting, and actually that was one of those first paintings I looked at thinking about the wood and streams, it's a composition. It's really big. It would not have been painted out in the open in plein air, but it has so much detail. And as you work with art historians, you learn like, Durand was putting in these other trees, but he wasn't just randomly putting them in. They were individual trees from other sketches. So we can ask things like, we can ask questions about epiphyte loads or moss or what have you loads on trees historically, and we can use all the trees, but we can't use that image to learn about tree density because we know that Durand added some trees. And so I think it's the engagement with art historians gives you that critical information that allows you to understand which questions you can ask scientifically and which you can't ask scientifically. And I think that ends up being a really kind of a really fun interaction on those.
Marlyse, can I get your perspective too on this and the value of these cross-disciplinary conventions that now you have one under your belt, and what you mostly took away from it?
Yeah, I don't want to speak. We have two ecologists here, so we're representing one side of this, but I did also just think it was very useful in the opposite direction as well. So, whether or not art historians were like, for an example, like, this tree, they're growing like this because, the artist feels like we need these linear lines to understand how we move through time. And you're like, well, actually, it turns out that these are probably just very young trees, or we think it's just young trees. And so I do think that they're also able to understand things that they wouldn't have been able to understand, not knowing species identity or, how trees grow architecturally in different sorts of habitats. And so just to add on to what Dana was saying, we get to understand what questions how can we inform our ecological questions? But I also think as art historians are starting to think about their arguments and why maybe something was represented or not, having that ecologist or field naturalist or kind of viewpoint helps them kind of understand like, it's not one or the other. It might be that there was a fire, and it might be that it's the aftermath of the Civil War, or it's probably some of both. But the other thing that I left being really fascinated with was around language and just different ways of going about doing scholarship across the different disciplines, and just the benefit of being able to understand that we might use the same word that means two different things in those in our specific contexts, or how do we write papers, or how do we communicate our findings, or even, one of the things that came up was that we tend to form hypotheses and ask research questions, and art historians tend to have arguments. And so just the way we construct and scientific method between those two fields is different as well. And so just broadly understanding how different disciplines work, I think just makes for better science overall, right? So one of the things that kept coming up was that just the sum is more than the overall product is more than like the sum of the parts.
Dana, I'm wondering what your standout moments, if you will, or were there any surprising moments that you've taken from this that will inspire you for the next steps in your work?
That's a good question. I mean, I think I just want to briefly jump on the point Marlyse made about we really wanted this conference to be a two-way street, not just ecologists siphoning information from art historians. And I apologize if I've framed it that way. There is an aspect of that, but we really wanted it to be an exchange where, bringing ecological insight to help art historians look at paintings, and there's this sort of there is a field within art history known as eco-critical art history that does dig into this ecological interpretation. So I just really appreciate that Marlyse brought that up, and that the goal of the conference was to really be hopefully advancing both fields by providing insight from each of the groups. So in terms of major takeaways, or really sort of exciting next steps, I think one of the things that we did with this conference was to try to sort of put people together, put interested and interesting people together. So we didn't have a specific here's definitely the next step going in. It was very much we know we have interesting people and we want to try to get everyone in the room to talk about ideas. And to me, there were just the particularly exciting thing was to see connections be made between people. So we had, for example, someone who was really interested in salt marsh paintings, and in his micro talk, he talked about, or in his lightning talk, he talked about this person Heed, who did a bunch of paintings. And one of the people there said, I have a chapter, one of the art historians said, I have a chapter in one of my books about heat. And the two of them went off and went down this really fun rabbit hole. So it wasn't, not rabbit hole, but sort of are working on trying to work together on something out of that. So it wasn't necessarily surprising, but to me that was really exciting, was just to have people make connections at this conference or this workshop where they were able to really drill down on stuff. The other fun thing was watching Eleanor talk to an ecologist who was explaining the different sort of tree structure and how that talked about whether they grew in open systems or closed systems, or open forests or closed forests. And so just watching that exchange to me was really the most exciting thing. And I don't know that we had a single thing where it's this is the next sort of exciting step, but we clearly planted seeds. And I think what we'll see is in the next couple of years, those exciting things are going to sort of evolve from this. At least that's certainly my hope. And that's the impression I got coming out of it.
And what would you like our listeners to know about this, Marlyse, in summary?
I think it's very easy for folks to kind of focus in on their one little special interest or their topic. And I think we live in, especially in the academic realm, in an increasingly specialized world. And the incentives aren't necessarily there to kind of step back and look broadly and multidisciplinary. But I think for me, the big take home is you can't anticipate the positive benefits of doing that. And so taking the time to think about, what would it mean to step out of my comfort zone and out of my field into a different one, and truly listen and look with a different set of eyes is really, really useful for all of us.
Any final thoughts, Dana?
I was just thinking the one thing that we didn't really touch on, and sort of a point that I think is really valuable in this, is this concept of shifted baselines. And that I think in the world today, our perception of what is normal is often based on what we see and what we remember. And being able to look back at this artwork and being able to engage with art historians to know that these really are accurate representations, I think is really important in helping us collectively to push our baseline back. I mean, the true baseline is maybe unattainable, but I think understanding and using our understanding and integration of art and ecology as we look at these paintings is I think hopefully a really fun and interesting and cool tool to help us understand what previous landscapes and environmental conditions looked like and were.
Marlyse Duguid, Senior Lecturer and Research Scientist at Yale, and Dana Warren, Associate Professor in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society at Oregon State University. Thank you both so much for taking time to come on the podcast and your contributions to this conference.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Well, joining me now, as always, for our regular updates from Oak Spring is Danielle Eady, the Director of Programs here. Danielle, we're back for July, and a sizzling July as well.
It certainly is. It is very warm here at Oak Spring, but we are making the best of this warm weather and staying busy as ever. So next week we have the Rare Book School is coming with 12 students. So the Rare Book School is based out of University of Virginia, UVA, in Charlottesville. And every year we partner with them to put on a residential Monday through Friday class. And we bring in an instructor, Roger Gaskell, who is a specialist on antiquarian books. So the focus of this class is 600 years of botanical illustration. So they're looking at the ways that bookmaking and botanical illustration and herbariums kind of developed alongside one another. So that's a class that we are delighted to be hosting very, very soon. And then for folks who are interested in our library collection, we also have the deadline for our residential class, Cultural and Natural Ecologies, is coming up at the end of July. So if anyone's interested in a class that is somewhat similar to our offering with the Rare Book School, the Cultural and Natural Ecologies is something I would definitely recommend. And then in terms of short courses, later on in August, we will have the deadline for a new course that we are very excited to offer in November, and that class is on viticulture. So it is a Wednesday through Friday class, one of our shorter residential classes, and it will be a bit about pruning grapes, grafting grapes, winemaking. The course will include a site visit to Lost Mountain, which is quite close to us, in a world-renowned winery and vineyard. So that's a new class that we're really looking forward to hosting, and the application for that, as well as Cultural and Natural Ecologies, can be found on our website under Programs Residential Short Courses. So I hope our listeners will check out those two short courses. And in terms of things going on over on our Rokeby farm, we just started the third session of our 5-week interdisciplinary residency. So we have a group of 10 artists, writers. This group even includes a dancer and performance artist who are staying on Rokeby farm. They'll be with us for 5 weeks, working on their own independent projects that all relate to plants, landscapes, and gardens in some way. So we are very delighted to have this group with us now. In terms of some of our more short-term programs and workshops coming up, in July, we have a marbling workshop with an artist, Sid Scher, who is coming from us from Richmond, Virginia. So the students in that class will be marbling silk scarves, and they'll also be looking at some of the books in the library, many of which the cover sheets have marbled pages, and Sid will be discussing how those pages were made. And then later in the month, we have a one-day workshop with artist Hilary Fail, who is an incredible textile artist based in Richmond, and that class will be creating lavender sachets for drawers and things to make different places smell nice, and they will be making cyanotite prints on top of those sachets as well. So that should be a really fun day. And then we also have 2 sessions of our floral arranging workshop coming up, and that's a fun opportunity to learn a bit about floral arranging with a special eye towards arranging and designing in the way that Mrs. Mellon had her flower arrangements made. So those are just a few of the things that we have coming up now, Chris.
Yes, and I'm thinking we're not that far off the September event of the year on the Rokeby Farm Festival side of the property.
Yes, our community festival is coming towards us. So that is a big community festival. It is a family-friendly event, but but of course, perfectly suited for adults as well. There will be plant walks, landscape walks, tree walks all around Rokeby Farm, so you can learn about our arboretum planting and some of the meadow restoration projects we have going on from our team members. There will also be food trucks, there will be beer and wine, and live music, and a couple pop-up art exhibits. And then we'll also have various vendors from our local area will have stands there as well. So there will be a little bit of shopping. So that's a super fun event that we definitely recommend, especially for anybody who maybe hasn't been to Oak Spring. It's a nice way to see a bunch of the different facets of what we have going on here.
And hopefully we'll be a little bit cooler than it is in July.
Fingers crossed.
And remind everybody how they can get more information about these programs and apply and the deadlines and so on.
Yes, to check out our one-day workshops, that would be under programs, one-day workshops, and then you could get tickets for the community festival, floral arranging, the workshop with Sid, and the workshop with Hillary. Those are all under one-day workshops under programs. And then to apply to our short courses, you would go to programs, residential short courses. So really that programs tab on osgf.org is where you can purchase tickets. And then of course you can keep an eye on everything else that we have going on by subscribing to our newsletter and then following us on Instagram and Twitter or X.
Super. Well, thank you, Danielle. And you'll be back, I know, next month with another update of things to come here at Oak Spring, and maybe a look back on the summer too as we're getting towards the fall. It happens so quickly because you have so many events through the summer. It's boom, boom, boom for you guys. It must be, I don't know how you keep it all straight. You have so many things going on during the summer months.
We certainly do. We stay busy, but it's a lot of fun.
Yes, absolutely. Well, keep up the good work, Danielle. Thank you so much for coming on and giving us an update, as always.
Thanks, Chris.
And that's it for this month's episode. Don't forget, if you're on your podcast app and you have an opportunity to share this with anyone you think you might enjoy the show, and also leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, because that increases our rankings and helps others find the show. I'll be back next month with another episode of the Oak Spring Podcast. So until then, thank you for listening.